All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Talking Christianity Apologetics. My name is Josh Gibbs, and today we are going to be talking about Open Theism and the end of the timeless God with my guests Will Duffy and R.T. Mullins. But some of the questions that we're going to be looking at identifying is, what about if God knew all future events and choices people would make prior to creating the world? Another question would be, do you still have free will if God could have created the world differently, but specifically chose this world to create? How do these things relate to a comparison of classical theology, classical theism versus open theism, and the timelessness of God? If you would, stay with us, and we'll be right back after this clip, and we'll get right into it.
Make sure today that you leave this place knowing that you are saved to the glory of God.
Thinks that one I'm going to choose. If you believe that, friends, you don't know the gospel.
Is that the wonder of the cross is that no one gets injustice. If you end up under the wrath of God, it is because you've rejected His provision for you, and you are justly punished for your sin.
To what the Scriptures teach. I think the Bible does teach that God desires the salvation of all men, and He has provided for the salvation of all men. And therefore, anyone who ends up under the wrath of God, it is because they have rejected His provision for them, and they are justly punished for their sins.
The question that seeks to provide an answer to this question: for whose sins did Jesus die? The extent of the atonement asks the question, for whose sins did Jesus die? There are only two possible answers to that question. Either Jesus died for the sins of some people, or Jesus died for the sins of all people.
All right, so let me get this off of the screen here. I meant to go through that in the introduction, but in a couple of weeks, we're going to be going through God, Time, and Theological Ramifications with Drew McLeod and Brian Wagner as well, so keep that in mind. As you should be able to see our guests up on the screen. We've got Dr. Ryan Mullins and Will Duffy. And for Dr. Mullins has got his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. He's published over 30 essays on various topics in philosophical theology related to models of God, philosophy of time, personal identity, the problem of evil, disability theology, the Trinity, and the incarnation. He's published 2 books, The End of the Timeless God from Oxford University Press in 2016, and God and Emotion from Cambridge University Press in 2020. Ryan has held research and teaching fellowships at the University of Notre Dame, the University of Cambridge, and the University of St. Andrews, as well as the University of Edinburgh. He also has a podcast called The Reluctant Theologian, where he covers topics ranging from soteriology and atonement to God and time. When not engaging in philosophical theology, he's often found at a metal show. And he's working on a couple new books right now called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, and another book, Divine Passability, A New Defense with Jordan Wesling and John Peckham. And of course, we just mentioned those other 2 books, The End of the Timeless God and the other being God and Emotion. So Ryan, welcome to Talking Christianity. It's good to have you on.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation, which is going to bring us to our other guest, Will Duffy. Will Duffy, you guys I'm sure are familiar with. You've seen him in debates in the past online with Matt Slick talking about open theism. He's the creator of OpenTheism.org, where you can find many of his and other open theism debates and articles, as well as upcoming events and other videos. You can also comment on their Open Theism forum, which is at theologyonline.com, or check out their highly Google-ranked article, Is God Outside of Time? There's also a section on OpenTheism.org that has 33 categories of scripture on open theism, which is opentheism.org/verses. And you can also find them on Instagram, OpenTheism.org, and then their YouTube channel, which is Open Theism channel on YouTube, where you can subscribe and hit the bell and get notifications for any upcoming videos from them. So, Will, welcome to Talking Christianity. It's good to have you on as well.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, for putting this together today.
It's good, man. I've really been looking forward to it. This conversation is, like I was telling you before we went live, I don't have all of these things worked out, but I'm kind of exploring the different ideas of kind of classic theism and open theism, and kind of some of the different ways that people have kind of tried to iron out the balance of God's foreknowledge, divine determinism, and free will. And these things, I don't have my mind wrapped around it all. I don't have my mind made up on where I stand, but I do think that conversations like this are helpful for me personally, because it pushes me, it stretches me, and it gets me to think about things like, whether or not I do have free will, if God created this whole thing, knowing how it was going to be before it even took place. So anyways, I think that we'll go ahead and jump into it. Let me switch over here to my notes and see if we can get rolling here. So, okay, my first question is really I want to establish what we're talking about. We've already kind of identified it's a comparison of classic theism with open theism, but maybe we can kind of start there and just identify what the difference would be between classical theism and timelessness to start. So, Ryan, maybe you could kind of give us an idea of what the difference of the two would be, classical theism and the timelessness of God, and then we can move forward and see where the conversation takes us from there.
Mm-hmm. So classical theism is a particular model of God. Let me start with the concept of God. So the concept of God is that God is an absolutely perfect being who is like the absolute ground or ultimate ground of reality. And so a model of God, what it tries to do is identify what does it mean to be perfect. And so it'll tell you whatever God's attributes are that make him perfect, and then what it means for God to be the absolute ground or ultimate ground of reality. So classical theism says God is absolutely perfect in the sense that God's got all the omni attributes, so omniscience, omnipotence, but that's not really unique because lots of other models of God have that. So what makes classical theism unique is its commitment to 4 divine attributes, which are divine timelessness, divine immutability, impassability, and simplicity. How they understand how God is ultimate, like the ultimate ground of reality, is they're going to say that God freely creates the universe ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Open theists typically say that as well, so like modified or neoclassical theists. But so what's really going to distinguish typically the open theist from like a classical theist is a commitment to those 4 unique divine attributes, whereas the open theist typically goes, I don't like any of that. I don't want any of those attributes. I'll take all the omnis; those are great, but timelessness, immutability, simplicity, impassibility, I don't want those. So that's kind of like, that's classical theism, at least in a nutshell.
Okay. Now, Will, would you have anything that you wanted to piggyback off of that? Would you agree that those 4 categories may be something that the open theist would not want to have anything to do with that the classical theist would?
Yeah, that's accurate. While there's overlap in these, various claimed attributes of God, they're not necessarily a complete package, though. So I think it's important to point that out. There'll be people who will hold to some and not the others, and then someone like myself would reject all 4 that Ryan mentioned.
Okay. Now, when we're talking about God being the greatest possible maximal being that could exist, why wouldn't we include attributes such as omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, those sorts of things, the omnis? Why wouldn't we include those sorts of things in the attributes of God when we're trying to consider God as a maximal being? And if we don't, does that take away from God being a maximally great being? Ryan, maybe you could answer that first, and then Will, I'll get your take on it.
So maybe I misspoke. So most models of God, when they're giving their analysis of what it means for God to be perfect, they will include those omnis in there.
Okay.
But what makes a model unique is if it's going to be unique, it needs to say something that the other models don't. And since omniscience, omnipotence, perfect goodness, pretty much everyone's like, that's definitely, like, those are great, those are cool, I like that. So those are like uncontested. Whereas like the ones that are contested, the ones that are controversial, are going to be things like timelessness, impassibility, or if like a non-classical theist, like an open theist, wants to say, well, God's passible. He gets sad sometimes, he suffers. Then those are going to be those are controversial things.
I see. Okay. Will, did you have anything you wanted to piggyback off of that?
Yeah, when it comes to the omnis, I think the importance there is the definition of those terms. And so what I like to do when I'm defining them is I like to add in God's will into the definitions. So, for example, omniscience would be defined as God knowing all things that he wants to know. I think that's important.
Yeah.
My theological journey, God's will has always played a pretty significant impact into kind of, me looking at these different various views. And so I think defining those is going to be key in these discussions.
Yeah. Okay, and for the audience sake, I do want to let you guys know a couple of things. One, Will informed me that we're streaming this live across 9 different time zones right now. So Dr. Mullins, he is in Scotland, and then Will is in Puerto Rico, and I'm in Kansas City. So we've kind of got a long range trying to get this thing live stream. And it doesn't help that I'm not hardwired in through an Ethernet cord. I'm just streaming it over the Wi-Fi, which I just was informed that it would be a lot better for you as the audience if I was hardlined in with an Ethernet cord. So that's my bad. I'll work on that in the future. But there is going to be a little bit of a delay with the video and the sound, which I'm sure you guys have noticed. But and Shannon, I know that you put this question in there, and I do want to let you guys know as well that you'll have a chance to call in at the end. And I'll put that number up on the screen. You should be able to see it up at the top. The number to call in is going to be 816-866-0025 if you would like to do that. Or you could even join the live stream and talk to Will and Ryan live with us. That link is going to be in the description box on whatever platform you're watching this from live. So you should be able to do that. If you don't want to do it either one of those ways, we'll be able to get your questions in as you send them in. So but this first question, I think it might be a good idea to get this out in the open before we really get too far into it. Well, obviously we're talking about open theism, classic theism, and how we would identify these things and bounce ideas off of what's the best definition for who God is and the attributes of God. And Shannon says, is Mullins an open theist? I think we all know Will Duffy is an open theist. We don't know is Ryan. Ryan, are you an open theist? Where do you stand on that?
No. So the model of God I affirm is usually called neoclassical theism or modified classical theism. So it'll reject one or more of those 4 classical attributes, and I want to reject all 4 of the classical attributes. And then it'll still affirm creation ex nihilo, so it's not going to be panentheism, and it'll affirm foreknowledge, so it's not open theism. The way you affirm foreknowledge, though, as a neoclassical theist, it's open. Like you could be a Calvinist, you could be a Molinist, you could be affirm simple foreknowledge, you could hold something called a time ordering account. So you've got some options,
okay.
But that's the thing that's going to distinguish it from open theism.
Okay, so I do want to get into that because that's where I'm at, is trying to wrap my mind around the foreknowledge idea and omniscience. Like, how are these things related? How is this related to God's omniscience? Because, Will, I know, just in the last segment you said that God would be omniscient, but he's omniscient based off of things he's chosen to know. To me, that might be a little bit of a limited definition, and I do want to unpack these things as we get into it. But I think as we're discussing classical theism and timelessness to start. What you just described, Ryan, as it's related to panentheism and pantheism and the difference between what you would believe there. Let's start with time. How would you define what time is? And does time exist only if change exists, or can it exist even if change does not exist?
So as I understand time, I would take time to be a natured entity that makes change possible. It's the thing that is the source of moments or instants, and it's the thing that unifies a series of moments, or what we might call like a timeline. So it's right there in the definition, time is more fundamental than change, because it's the thing that makes change possible. I mean, there are going to be people who reject that, who hold to what's called a relational theory of time, that think that time exists if and only if change exists, and that change is just like a relationship between events. But I've got reasons for thinking that it's like deeply circular and incoherent, so I usually reject that kind of view. But yeah, I think time is this natured entity that makes change possible. Okay.
So time is this natured thing that makes change possible. I think I missed something right at the end there. It makes so time is this thing that makes change possible. Okay, and it's ordered. Yep. It's sequential. You would agree with that?
It's what accounts for that stuff. Yeah.
I see.
So it's responsible for making those things. Yeah.
Okay, well, what would your definition of time be, and as it's related to what Ryan just laid out there, as it's related to change?
Sure. Time is actually very difficult to define. You'll notice when you get into the circles discussing the nature of time and God, they often will avoid defining time and just kind of move on.
Yeah.
The definition that I currently use, which I did not come up with, but I really like it, is that time is the endurance of reality. So my position is that time is an aspect of reality similar to math or logic, and that's kind of where I stand at the moment.
So you would just take the position that it just is, it just exists. In that sense, it's just part of reality. And more specifically, it seems like you would hold the position that there is no future, there is no past, there's just the present, which would kind of transition to our next point in the conversation, I think. But would you agree with that? There is no future, there is no past, there's just the present, and that's what time is as related to reality?
Yeah, so I am a presentist.
Okay.
I do hold the presentism, and so absolutely in agreement that the future does not exist, the past does not exist. And I think it's important to always clarify when discussing presentism that even though the past and the future both don't exist, the past did exist, which makes it knowable. And then I would say the future as non-existent would be unknowable.
I see. Okay. And, okay, now, Ryan, when we're talking about time, and you had mentioned panentheism and pantheism, some people would say that time is created. As related to the cosmological argument, time didn't exist prior to God creating time and the beginning and those sorts of things, which would create problems if time didn't begin to exist, because then it would be kind of part of who God is or an attribute of God. I don't know where you would stand on kind of the differentiation of whether time was created, whether it's an attribute of God, or how that would relate to panentheism and that sort of thing. But where do you go with that? Was time created? Was it uncreated? Where do we start that side of the conversation?
So I'm starting to get closer to a view that wants to identify time as an attribute of God or some aspect of God. So it would be uncreated.
Okay.
But I don't think that entails panentheism, because panentheism, part of the story of panentheism is you have to deny creation out of nothing. And I don't deny creation out of nothing. I affirm creation out of nothing. Yeah. So it's not going to be panentheism. Pantheism itself, that says God and the universe are identical.
Right.
Well, I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I'm identical to time. And I don't think Will is identical to time, and I don't think the universe is identical to time, especially because we all have different modal properties. And so, like, I didn't always exist, and on this view, time would always exist. So we can't be identical to time. If time is an aspect of God, then I can't be identical to God. So this doesn't entail pantheism, as far as I can tell.
Okay, so you would take the position that time is uncreated, but it doesn't deny creation ex nihilo, and that it's an attribute of God. But I guess my question would be, there's an element of time. There's three elements of time: past, present, and future. If time is an attribute of God, how does that not place God within a sequential format of time unfolding, or what Will calls duration of reality, or does that make God eternally present in the past, present, and future consecutively, all at once? Mm-hmm. How would you look at that side of the conversation?
So it depends what kind of moves you want to make with regards to the ontology of time. So the ontology of time is the question, what moments of time exist? And so, like Will, I want to affirm presentism and say only the present exists. Yeah. If you could affirm something else, like an eternalist view, where all moments in the timeline are actualized or real, they'll equally exist. I don't like that view. We can go into that later. But so if you're a presentist, like me, then you would just say a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. So prior to the universe, there's just one moment, God hanging out by himself, not doing anything. And then the next moment would be God doing something. So if God wants to do something, then he changes and brings about things being subsequently otherwise. So he brings about a universe What kind of universe does he want to create? I don't know. It's up to you. If you want to be a Calvinist, you could say he creates a Calvinist universe. If you want to be an open theist, you could say he creates an open universe. That's kind of, so you got a lot of options here with this sort of view.
Okay, now Will, let's go back to kind of where we started that conversation, as it was related, as it's related to time. I'm losing my voice a little bit. Okay, so do you see time as being something that's created, uncreated, as an attribute of God? Where do you go with that side of the conversation there? How do you handle that?
Sure. Yeah, I do not think time is something that's created. There are metaphysical realities. I mentioned a couple of them already, such as math and logic, that I don't think people would say God created. Christians who disagree like to use terms like God is bound by time, and I think using to try to frame the conversation to where they want it to go. But I do think that there are aspects of reality that really, if we look at it deeply, are really probably also describing God himself and God's reality. And so that's kind of where I put time.
I see. Okay, now I want to get your guys' take on this. We can take calls and people join in the live stream as we go through this episode, or we can wait till the end. How do you guys want to do that, Ryan and Will? Because we do have a guest that is wanting to join the live stream and jump in on the conversation now. If not, we can wait till the end. It's totally up to you.
It doesn't matter to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good with whatever.
All right, that'll work. Let me get Scott unmuted, and I'm going to add you into the live stream here with Will and Ryan. So, Scott, welcome to Talking Christianity. We've got you on, and I'll turn it over to you for whatever your question or comment is.
Well, I'm glad to get in early. I was expecting a flood of people to line up en masse like lemmings to find out just what to think about God and time in relation to God's being. Now, I wrote in the comments that my view would be similar to Ryan's, in that it would be, I've used the word duration, that it would be a phenomena of the existence, the conscious existence of God's being. And I suppose, can you hear me still?
Yep, yeah, we can hear you just fine. Yep.
Okay. I saw some funny business on my screen. In other words, that God is conscious, he's a living being, and that consciousness itself, whether you can say it's an ontology or not, consciousness is. And for consciousness to be, there must be duration. So whether there's an ontological link there, I'm not sure that needs to be answered. But the first principle would be God is conscious.
Yeah.
And there has to be duration.
So yeah, that's interesting, which would seem to kind of, in my mind, go back to the beginning of the consciousness of God, but I don't know how that would relate to kind of a duration of existence as the way that you're defining it. But Ryan and Will, I'll see if I can get your take on that first, Ryan, and then we'll jump to you, Will, if that's something that we can address, is what Scott's bringing up here on the relationship of consciousness to time, and saying that he doesn't seem like it needs to really be defined.
Yeah, so there's two different thinkers that would be holding something very similar to what you're describing here. So the first would be Henri Bergson, and then the other one would be J.R. Lucas. And so they try to draw a very tight connection between consciousness and time and duration. And so they're going to say, well, J.R. Lucas says this more clearly than Bergson does together, because if I'm making time an attribute of God, well, I want to say his consciousness is also another attribute. So you're still going to get both of them. But yeah, there are various thinkers who do a lot of serious stuff in philosophy of time who would be just doing something exactly like what Scott's describing.
Okay. Will, what would your take on that be? As he's saying, he doesn't seem like it needs to be defined, but if there is an ontology of time, then the duration of time would seem to be related in some way to the consciousness of God.
Yeah, I think making making the point that God is a living being is important here. Succession is like oil and water to timelessness. And so I think just looking at maybe God's thoughts and God's thoughts happening in successive order, which seems very natural to us, would make sense. And so I definitely agree with what Scott is saying.
Okay, Scott, let's turn it back to you. Where do you want to go on that side? Did they address what it is that you wanted to bring up, or is there a follow-up question or comment there?
Well, whenever I listen to a podcast with Ryan, I've always got paper and pencil to write down references here.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, really. The notion of being created in God's image and likeness, I think, gives us a kernel to work with in which to model what God's experience of reality is.
Yeah.
The word image and likeness are related words, so there's an emphasis there. And so from that kernel, we could take our own experience of consciousness. It implies a before and an after, and it's linear. So one would test that by projecting upwards and seeing, does this conflict with anything in the biblical record? And so far, I've found a harmony there that has not challenged me fundamentally to let go of.
Yeah.
But I'm still in dialogue.
You know what? I think that's a really good place to kind of take that side of the conversation, because you get a lot of different takes on what it means to be made in the image of God. And some people would even take it so far as to say that our experience is something that is so other than the experience of God that God is almost unknowable to us. And when you point out the idea of what you just brought up, Scott, that we were made in the image and the likeness of God, that it would seem like the reality as we know it is some sort of a revelation of what God actually designed us to be, to know Him. But I saw you, Ryan, you were nodding your head in agreement with what Scott was saying, and I wonder if there's something more that you had to add on that side of the conversation.
No, I think that's fun. I think what Scott's saying is fundamentally right. If you're committed to Christianity, then you're going to be committed to this idea of the image of God. And if God is so utterly and completely unlike us, then I don't know what it could mean to be made in His image. Yeah. And so I would think we would lose that aspect of the biblical teaching. And also, when I look at the classical tradition, they really are looking at human nature as a model for the different kind of perfections that we want to predicate of God. So knowledge, power, goodness, freedom, rationality, all these things that they want to say, yep, God's got that to the maximal degree. What they're doing is they're looking at human nature and saying, this is something that's true about God. And I think that an open theist or a neoclassical theist like me is doing the same thing by going, well, what else do I see when I look at myself?
Right.
Experience, having experiences, undergoing succession. When I exercise my power, I'm not doing one thing and then I am doing something.
Yeah.
Well, why would God be any different? So yeah. And then you look at the biblical story, it looks like God kind of changes all the time, mainly because it says He changes, and so details. But yeah, so I think what Scott's talking about is describing something that I think is a part of what it looks like to do Christian theology. Not the whole story of Christian theology, but I think it's part of it.
Okay, now, Will, I don't see you disagreeing with anything that Ryan just said there, but maybe you do, or maybe you are in agreement and just want to kind of carry that thought out some more. What would you do with that?
No, I definitely agree. Some people look at this as a problem. I don't necessarily look at it as a problem, but when I decided to take theology seriously, my faith seriously, Christianity seriously, I kind of skipped the, classical theism. I skipped, what the early church fathers taught, and I really just went straight to the Bible. Not opposed to any of that, but that's really kind of where my path started, and it's what shaped what I believe today. And so I don't have, a hard grasp on what classical theism teaches. And so that, for better or for worse, was not something I had to get rid of.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Scott, I wonder if there's anything else that you would like to kind of carry over from what we just talked about with the image of God and the likeness of God and us being able to know God as it's related to time and timelessness. If not, that's totally fine. But if you had something more that you wanted to add, I'll put the ball back in your court.
Yes, yes, please. It seems like we have a good agreement with the biblical passage, for instance, in Genesis 22:12, where Abraham is put into the test of killing Isaac. And in the Hebrew, when God says, "Now I know that you fear God," that's first person singular, and it's predicated by a noun. So for that to be a truthful representation of who God is, without a parsimony about, well, if he's out of time, that doesn't work. If that's a truthful revelation, then that seems to be an authoritative statement that we are bound to address in its fullness and say, there's no going back around and saying, well, he really did know.
Yeah.
That would mean he's opposite. So that would be my thought.
No, that's a good thought. Okay, so in Genesis 22, where God makes that statement, "Now I know," the classical theist would typically say, if you believe that God is taking in information and he's learning, then he's not maximally great. He's not omniscient. Now, Will, I know that you've addressed this on opentheism.org, and you've talked about this in some of the debates that you've had. I would like to turn it to you first, and then I'll get your take on that, and see if this is one of those things that you would agree with as it's in the attributes of God, and whether it does diminish the maximally great person of whether or not God is the maximally great being as it's related to omniscience. But Will, let me get your take on it. I'm probably not wording that exactly right, but this is a great passage to go to for this conversation.
Yeah, it's great. When it comes to maximally great, perfect being theology, I think the conversation is difficult because we're talking about something that's very subjective. For example, what is a perfect baby, or what is a perfect river? It's just very subjective, and so I think that's an issue. In terms of Genesis 22:12, I have a hard time reading and understanding that passage, especially considering, the context of the previous, 10 chapters in Genesis. And the reality is that we really wanted to do something with, and Abraham essentially, had faith that was strong, then he wavered, faith that was strong, then he wavered. And so we see God testing to know, which is something that we see all throughout the Bible. And in Genesis 22, it's a test to know what he would do. And so I think the statement, "Now I know," is the reality of the result of the test, and it's a reality of God wanting to learn something and figuring it out.
That's good. Okay, and I'll toss it over to you, Ryan, but before I get your take on that, it looks like Christopher Fisher says to Mullins, "Do you affirm the classical definition of omniscience in which God's knowledge is ungenerated, neither within himself nor outside of himself?"
No, I wouldn't. So, well, okay, there's a couple aspects here. So first is the typical definition of omniscience is that God knows all the truth values of all the propositions. And then when you combine impassability with it, then God's knowledge can't be, derived from something outside of himself. So you've got omniscience on the one hand, and you've got impassibility doing the work of saying, like, God can't be influenced by anything outside of himself. So all of God's knowledge then has to be based on just knowing himself perfectly and knowing his actions perfectly. I don't think that works. For all the reasons I lay out in my book, God and Emotion. So I would reject that. But So yeah, but I'm happy with the idea of like God knowing the truth values of all propositions. That seems fine to me. But the propositions, they change their truth values over time. And then certain experiential knowledge you can only acquire by actually experiencing reality. So God can't have experiential knowledge of, Moses, but until Moses comes into existence. He can't have experiential knowledge of what it's like to see Abraham actually trust him until Abraham actually does in fact trust him. So that's going to be a new kind of experience that God has, this first person, this acquaintance with Abraham himself. So I think, to like what Scott was saying, is if that passage is really saying something about this is what God is like, then whatever sort of story you tell about the nature of God, it better not be the exact opposite of what that passage is teaching. Yeah,
that's good. Okay, now Scott, let me toss a question back to you. What sort of impact would this idea of how you understand God and His experience with His creation, to relate back to your own practical life and your walk with God? Does this impact that in any way to make it more real to you, that it's an experience that you're having together and not something that was prescripted in some way?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I think it breathes life into my experience. I remember 47 years ago when I was first confronted with this idea of is God an eternal now, or is duration an aspect of His existence? And for me at the time, I was so young that the classical ideas, the little bit I knew about it, froze him out of my experience, because I would consciously say, well, if I think I'm hearing from God now or impressed by something in Scripture, if He knew it from eternity and whatnot, and then that formed a bridge between me and my notional picture of God. But having this made in the image of God as a kernel of notion, that idea led to this consonance with Scripture. Then I can believe that what He's saying to others in Scripture, now I know, or now I'm seeing that you're going to reject what I'm saying, things of that nature. It doesn't cause a break in my normal experience. So
that's good.
Yes, it's integral to my relationship with God. May I say one other thing?
Yep.
There's something that should be thrown out somewhere in this conversation, and that's the notion of the incipiency of the human will. And by that, we're talking about a notion that was brought out more in McCabe's era, around the 1880s, in his books on divine omniscience. And that is that there's something about man you can't fully be put in the test tube. There's always going to be a may or a may not about his ultimate choices. And that is the crown of creation, of being made in God's image. So if we look at it from the vantage point of this is what God has created and what He wants, then we're saying other ideas of perfection, when they tangent off into the mathematically abstract ideas, then you have to say, I can't wear that.
Okay. Okay, so let's take that and run with it a little bit, because that'll actually kind of transition to this next point in our conversation that we wanted to get to, and that is kind of this idea, the freedom of God or the imprisonment of God. If we're made in the image of God, then in some way God is either free or imprisoned within His own knowledge, or His freedom to choose between what may or may not be, or His freedom to choose otherwise, to do something new, to do something different. And Will, you talk about this a lot. In your defense of the freedom of God, is God actually free to create something new? Is he free to make a new song? Is He free to create a new butterfly? And to me, Scott, if I'm understanding what you're saying, that us being made in the image of God, it implies some sort of freedom as God is free, and able to do something new, or to create something new, or to write a new song. But just tell me, am I understanding you right there? And then if so, then we can kind of take that point and transition and move on to where we're going next in the conversation.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Okay, Will, maybe you can take that and see what you think as it's related. I think we kind of already touched on this a little bit with the image of God and the freedom of God, but maybe you can take it in your own words and not just let me speak for you, because I know that this is kind of a passion of yours in describing the freedom of God and his ability to do new things and not to be bound by his knowledge in some sense.
Yeah, for sure. Over a decade ago, I don't remember exactly how long ago it was, maybe closer to 2 decades ago, I was caught up in the Calvinism versus Arminianism debate, and it was all centered on man's freedom. And I don't really know what it was, but one day it just hit me that, wait a minute, what about God's freedom? What about God's free will? And so I decided to kind of take a detour, if you will, and just focus on that. And the more I thought about God's freedom, the more clear it was. Adding in humans really just muddied the waters, at least for me personally. And so I just started with, let's get rid of creation for a second. Let's just look at God and his will. And I came to the conclusion that, God had the ability to create or not create. He had the freedom to do that. He had the freedom to design the universe in any way that he would like to. He could have designed it differently, etc. And that was incredibly foundational for me, and still is to this day, of what I believe about God. And then secondarily then, which I think is super important, is I do make the argument that, we have a free will because God himself has a free will, and we were created in his image and likeness.
Okay. All right, Ryan, where would you go with that conversation? Now, I do want to transition from that into, maybe I'll just bring it up now, get your take on that and transition from that to your article titled, Doing Hard Time, Is God the Prisoner of the Oldest Dimension? And in that article, you say, for classical theists, to say that God is timeless is to say that God necessarily exists, 1, without beginning, 2, without end, 3, without succession, 4, without temporal location, and 5, without temporal extension. And then you talk about conditions 1 and 2 seem obvious, but I want to get your take on that and see if we can transition into this idea of God being the prisoner of the oldest dimension.
Yeah, so I'll try to set this up so that way Will can run his argument against like the Calvinists or something like that, saying like they undermine God's freedom or something like this. So the classical theist wants to affirm the same thing that Will does, which is God could have existed without a universe. God was free to create or not create. And then some, but not all, classical theists want to say God's got a bunch of different options. Some think that God has to create the best possible universe. Others think there is no best possible universe, so he's got some options of what to create. But the classical theists and the classical Christian tradition want to say God did not have to create, and there's a state of affairs where God exists without the universe. Can they do that consistently? We'll find out in a little bit.
Yeah.
So here's what they want to say about timelessness. So to be an eternal being is different from being a timeless being, because you've got what it means to be eternal, and then if you want to say timeless or temporal, that's a further claim. So to be an eternal being is to exist without beginning and without end. And so if God necessarily exists, you get eternal existence for free, because a necessary being cannot begin to exist because it always exists, and it cannot fail to exist because that's part of what it means to be necessary. Now, timelessness wants to go further and say, not only does God exist without beginning, without end, but God exists without succession, meaning God doesn't do one thing and then another and then another and then another, because that would be to undergo succession or sequence or change. Then they want to say, well, God doesn't have temporal location. So, because if you have temporal location, if you exist at a moment or in a moment, well, then you are a resident of time, is the way that Franz Rosenkranz and what's his name, Fabrice Correa put it. So you're a resident of time if you exist at or in a moment of time. And the classical theist, classical Christian tradition says God doesn't exist, in time. It doesn't exist in a moment. And then the final thing is they want to say God doesn't have this temporal extension, which just means that God doesn't persist over a series of moments. Because like you and I, we all persist from moment to moment. And they want to say, well, if you're really timeless, you can't do that. You're not gonna be persisting from moment to moment. So that's kind of like an unpacking, I guess, of how the classical thesis is going to understand timelessness. And then, like I said, they also want to affirm, like Will does, that God doesn't have to create. He's free to create or not create.
Okay. And there's a lot of different areas that we can go from here with that. And Ryan, I know what your take is on that, but I know you also want to turn this over to Will and give him an opportunity to address it. But before we do that, Scott, do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we get back to Will and Ryan and pick up where we left off? I'll give you an opportunity.
Okay.
Do what?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect.
We'll reserve that sometime later.
That'll work. And you're welcome on. Obviously, we'll turn it back over as we go through towards the end. If you want to call in later, you can too. So thank you for calling in, Scott. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks.
Okay, so Will, let's get your take on that. How's it related to God and being time-bound and his freedom? And what does that do with Calvinism or Arminianism, and where do you stand on that?
Sure. Yeah, so as Ryan touched upon, the idea that God, did not have to create, that he literally chose to create, is very difficult to reconcile with timelessness. I think a logical conclusion of timelessness is really that creation has existed co-eternally with God. And so I've got serious issues with that. And in terms of God's, freedom and taking a look at these very foundational issues of God creating, choosing to create, designing creation, etc. Open theism is named such because we believe that the future, including God's future, is open and not settled in any way. And so the other views, Calvinism, Arminianism, even Mullinism, to some extent, have a settled future. And so I think that that's problematic with each one. It's problematic for different reasons. But if God's own future is settled, I think that's, approaching a dangerous position, which removes God's free will.
Yeah.
And so that's, that's big for me. And that's one of the reasons that I'm an open theist. And so, my goal is not to tell God who he is, what he knows, what he's allowed to do, what he can't do, etc. I'm trying to really extract the truth and extract the reality of who God is, what he knows, his nature, his existence, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so on that side of the conversation, as it's related to Mullinism, Calvinism, and Arminianism, I was having a conversation in a Facebook group a while back with Tim Stratton on Mullinism, and obviously he's written the book. I can't remember the full title of it, but Mere Mullinism is part of the title. And Tim says that obviously Mullinism would be God considering all the different types of worlds that are possible to create, and it just so happens that the world that he did create would be the best possible world to create, which would include the free choices of human beings that in this world were free. They were free to choose whatever they chose. And to me, one thing that I was drawing out is it just seems like to me it's still just as determined as a classical theist or even a Calvinist or Arminian would see God and time, because he's taking into consideration a world to create and eliminating all the other worlds to create and choosing what world is going to be created, which includes the free choices, supposedly, of his creation. So I know that's not in our notes, but before I forget, that's something that I've been tossing around in my head is this idea of what are the counterfactuals that Mullinism seems to present as an option against open theism, and whether or not the future truly is open, that counterfactuals would be something to kind of counteract that side of becoming an open theist, I say. So anyways, Ryan, maybe I can get your take on this, and then we'll get it back to Will. Do you see any objections to Mullinism, Arminianism, or Calvinism being just as determined as each one of those other groups, or do you see some sort of way that your view opens it up to where none of them would be I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but maybe you can pick it up and just run with it.
I've got an idea. So there's one way. So I'll take the I want to push back on Will's argument for just a second and see what he does with it, to try to help out like even a Calvinist. I'll do that for the Calvinist today. So imagine someone like John Duns Scotus walks in the room, and Will, you're like, you can't get God any sort of freedom if he like has this sort of like determines how the future is going to go. And Scotus is like, all right, well, I was going to say hold my beer, but he's from Scotland, so he's going to be like, hold my whiskey. And so Scotus is like, all right, there's these things called logical moments in the life of God. They're a lot like temporal moments. I swear they're not temporal. Please don't think of them as temporal. They're logical moments. And so at the very first logical moment, God knows all the possibilities. Does God know what's going to happen? Well, no, because he hasn't determined what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But he knows at the first logical moment, he knows all the possibilities. And then at the next logical moment, God decides, I want to create a universe. And which one? That one. Not those other ones. Those are not good ones. But this one. I want to create this one. And so then at the logical moment after that, God all of a sudden now has this foreknowledge of what will in fact happen.
Yeah.
So there was the state of affairs at that first logical moment where God's future, logical future, because not temporal, because he's not temporal. It got to be timeless. His logical future is completely and utterly open. And then it gets, more determinate as we go to the next logical moment, and so on. And this is a sort of like thing that like Calvinists and Mollinists and Arminians, like they build off of this sort of story that Scotus tells. So I don't know, what do you kind of think of this sort of story before like I might like run like something different, but like, yeah, how would you respond to something like that?
Yeah. So this is the logical versus chronological argument, which I don't think really works. They use examples which are very different than God actually acting, than with God actually creating. For example, they'll use like a math problem. William Lane Craig loves to talk about this. Even Ryan, even as you were, attempting to, use their argument, the truth still comes out, which is that there is a moment where God doesn't know, and then there's a moment where God does know. And so if that's the reality of the situation, two things just fell. One is timelessness fell, because we have succession, we have a before and after. And then actually, maybe I should say three things fell. Then we have omniscience and foreknowledge in this context not being eternal. And then I would argue then immutability falls because we have a change in God, which is going from not knowing to knowing, going from seeing all the possible worlds and choosing one of them. And so I think that, at least for me, thinking through their argument logically, that's where I would end up.
Okay, so Ryan, do you see any contradictions between a logical progression and a chronological progression? Because it seems like the classical theist would say there is no chronological progression where God is having a logical progression, and to me that just seems contradictory. But I don't know how to work those things out like you and Will do, so I'll just turn it over to you and see what you think.
Well, so I think Will's point about like when people give these math examples, I think that's a really good point, because when you're giving a math example, you're not talking about logically contradictory states of affairs. You're talking about logical order of things that are all perfectly consistent to obtain simultaneously. Like 2 + 2 = 4. There's a logical progression of the 2 + 2, and then I get the 4.
Right.
Well, that's all consistent with like obtaining in a single timeless moment. But God not knowing the future and God knowing the future, both obtaining in a single simultaneous moment, that kind of looks like a contradiction, because you've got God knowing and God not knowing all from all eternity. If that's not a contradiction, then I don't know what a contradiction is. So I think Will's right to push back on that and be like, this is a serious problem. Well, so let me help the Calvinist out in a different way then. So say the Calvinist like John Feinberg. So he's like, timelessness, that's awful, it's unbiblical. Let's get away from it. But God determining the future in this sort of way, that's perfectly biblical, according to John Feinberg. Now, if he's going to have this sort of temporal story, he'll still say at the first temporal moment, not a logical moment, because that stuff's weird. The first temporal moment, God's future is completely open. It really is. And God hasn't determined anything. And then God looks at all the possible worlds and he goes, that one. I like that one. And so at the next logical moment, or the next temporal moment, then God does select, this is how things are going to go. And so you get the freedom there, because you really do have God considering a completely open future and then determining how things are going to go after that. So God makes a free decision. And since this whole debate that we're looking at just this moment is, can we get God freedom? I think a Calvinist at least can get the freedom, divine freedom there. Will it get you human freedom? That's a separate question. But since we're looking at the divine freedom, I think that's where the Calvinists, if they want to affirm temporality, I think they could go this way. I don't know. What do you think of that, Will?
Yeah, so I refer to this position as classical Calvinism. I'm not an expert by any means, but when I research, historically, going even, pre-Calvin and pre-Arminius, what I see Calvinists arguing what you just said, Ryan, which is that they're not arguing for timelessness, they're not arguing for atemporality. And I actually think that that's logically consistent. I rarely meet a Calvinist today. I mean, it's incredibly rare. Maybe 1 out of 500 that will make this argument, but I actually think that it works logically. And so then the reality is, it's referred to as God's decree in their confessions. And so then the next step, once we have found common ground, which is, okay, now that's a logical position, is, did God actually do that? Was there this decree of everything exhaustively? Does that work with scriptures, etc.? And again, I don't think so, but that would be the next step in my mind.
Okay, now we've got a couple of comments that have come in that are related to what we're talking about right here, and Christopher Fisher is one of them, who says, anyone who affirms the classical attribute of simplicity does not believe that God has potentiality or ability to choose between options. And Patrice Patel says, it seems to me that to know all possibilities logically seems to require that all possibilities must exist logically before God knows them. So there is some sort of sequential time element here. And Will, the way that I understand your argument as it's related to the eternal decree is there is some sort of free knowledge and natural knowledge that precedes the decree. And I don't know how to wrap those things together in some sort of timeless manner that they all happen sequentially, or not sequentially, they all happen at the same moment without happening sequentially. So you've got God's natural knowledge is free knowledge, and then the decree. I mean, you don't have the decree, then the natural knowledge and the free knowledge to make the decree, and then to create. But it seems like it does go in order as free knowledge, natural knowledge, then the decree, and then the creation. But how would that be related to what Chris Fisher and Patrice Patel brought up, seeming that it logically seems to require that all possibilities must exist logically before God knows them?
Yeah, so, again, I know I mentioned this already, but I'm going to say it again, which is that I think it's really easy for us as theologians, maybe philosophers, to, say this is what God knows, this is what God must know. He's got free knowledge, he's got natural knowledge. I think it's important to give God the freedom to know things or to not know things. Yeah. So, for example, biblically, we are commanded to, take our thoughts captive and focus on things above. And so I'm not someone who believes that God eternally, thought about all of the horrible things that were possibilities and all of the different ways people could be evil to other people. And so is that something that he could choose to know? I think definitely possibly, but I don't know if that's something he desired to or actually did attempt to know.
Okay, now I think that's important to the conversation, and Ryan, I do want to get your take on this as well, because I think that when we talk about the God being temporal or timeless, it could be related to God's knowledge prior to creation, and whether or not he actually planned the world and created the world that he wanted it to be exactly the way it is, including all the evil. And obviously this carries over into some of the things that you talk about in your book, The End of the Timeless God, and how it relates to soteriology, eschatology, and just the practical side of your Christianity, how you think about God and timelessness, and or God and time more specifically. But I guess the next question would be, in contrast, what would it mean to say that God is temporal?
So Will and I have already kind of alluded to it a bit throughout. So I'll just, yeah, I think it's good to just get it more precise. So if you're going to say God's temporal, you're still affirming God's eternal. So you're going to say God exists without beginning and without end, because again, that just follows from God's necessary existence. But you're going to say that God can have succession. So God can undergo change from doing one thing after another after another. God can have temporal location. So God exists right now. So if you're a presentist, you're going to say, when does God exist? Well, he exists now. And then if you're an eternalist, you're going to say, well, he exists at all the moments, because all the moments are equally real. I don't want to affirm eternalism, but if you want to, there you go. And then you would say that God also has temporal extension, which just means that God has some kind of persistence. So if you're a presentist, you're going to say God has endures through time. He has numerical identity over time. If you affirm eternalism, you're probably going to affirm some sort of view where, like, there's these things called temporal parts, and so you would say that God has temporal parts. So there's the temporal part of God located at all the different moments on the timeline. So you got some options here, again, of how you want to do it. But I guess one of the biggest things, I guess, for people listening or watching is that God can undergo succession. That's the biggest thing for a temporalist.
Okay, and it seems like oh, where was I going with this? Okay, so we're talking about the attributes of God, and some of them being the immutability of God, the omniscience of God. And it seems like, Ryan, you're saying that as it's related to the omniscience of God, that would include all possibilities, and God knowing extensively and exhaustively all possibilities of any choice or action that anybody could make, but not necessarily that he knows the actual choices that they necessarily would make. Is that a distinction that you're willing to kind of stand by and say, well, God knows all the possibilities and the outcomes of any of these possible scenarios that people could make, but he doesn't necessarily know the decisions and choices that they would make exhaustively, if I'm wording that correctly?
No, I get what you're trying to say, though. So typically, as I understand it, it's usually pretty uncontroversial to say God can know all the logical possibilities. So I don't think that's very controversial. Will's point is interesting because he could, but does he want to? Maybe he's got good reasons to not want to. And so that's an interesting conversation to have. But just the idea that God could know all logical possibilities, that's usually pretty standard fare, because the claim is that logical possibilities, or the modal scope of reality, is grounded in God's nature. Or something sometimes called the divine ideas, because God knows all the ways he could have things participate or imitate his nature. So yeah. So even an open theist, I think, can say God has natural knowledge of all possibilities. Then you got these other questions, though, is can God know what creatures would do in all possible circumstances? And then does God know what they will do? Those are different things. Okay. The logical possibilities, that I think I think that is uncontroversial typically.
Okay. And okay, well, let's get your take on that. And we've got a caller coming in. I'll get the caller on the line, but I do want to give you a chance to kind of respond to what Ryan brought up there as a potential area that may need drawn out a little more on your perspective, as it's related to God knowing all possibilities. Even, does God know all the possibilities, or are there some things he's chosen not to know?
Sure. It's definitely a highly philosophical conversation. Unfortunately, we don't have a verse that says God knows all possibilities. We don't have a verse that says God has middle knowledge.
Yeah.
Shannon actually asked a question that would tie into this, if you want to go over that after I respond. But anyway,
Oh yeah.
For me, I want to look at Scripture. And I want to say, okay, let's go through Scripture, Genesis to Revelation, and let's determine, what kind of knowledge God has. And, you mentioned the 33 categories that I have, helped create on opentheism.org of verses. And I would say that, some of those categories would tend to appear that God does not have, knowledge of all of these possibilities. Obviously, these verses are, debated, but we have multiple times in Scripture where God says that something did not enter his mind. And so I think that that's highly problematic for people that think God knows all possibilities.
Yeah. Okay, and before we introduce our guest, Kyle Vollmer, I do want to get to Shannon's question. Shannon Herring said, and I saw it earlier, I wanted to get to it, but I forgot. So Shannon says to Duffy, in 2 Samuel 23, this is one of my favorite passages in kind of understanding whether it's counterfactuals from a Molinist perspective or whether it's counter-knowledge from a dynamic omniscience perspective. It says in 2 Samuel 23:12, God tells David, the men of Keilah will give him over to Saul. How could God know this? And obviously this plays into what actually happened in the story.
Well, number one, the important thing here is that it actually did not happen. So interestingly enough, I have conversations with other theologians, and that is something that's not known by everyone. And so we have something here which is being stated by God, which we can't look at the result and say, it was accurate, it wasn't, etc. And so, this is a passage used by a lot of Molinists for middle knowledge. My response really is simply this. God is communicating to David present knowledge. He knows the heart state of these men. He knows exactly what they're doing. Saul is, trying to, capture David, and literally he knows exactly what they're doing. And so he's telling them, hey, this is what they're planning. This is where they're headed. And if you stay here, you're going to be captured. So you probably should leave. That's how I look at it.
Yep. No, I'm with you on that. And he left, and he wasn't captured, and he wasn't given over to Saul. So, Ryan, how would you respond to that? And then we'll get to Kyle. I've got you on the screen. I know you're being patient. We'll get to you as soon as I get Ryan's take on this. So thank you for being patient.
No, I think that passage is perfectly consistent with Molinism and open theism, because the open theist, the kind of predictive power that God has on open theism, I think should be pretty high. So I feel like God could definitely look and see, like, what are those guys over there doing? Oh yeah, David, if you go over there, this is how things are going to go. So let's don't go over there. I feel like that passage should be consistent with open theism and Molinism. Yeah,
I agree. Cool. Okay, let's get you unmuted. Kyle, it looks like you've got yourself muted if you want to get unmuted. And you are on with Will and Dr. Mullins, so I'll turn it over to you for either your question or your comment.
Cool. Well, how's it going, guys? Thanks for letting me on. And I know both of Ryan and Will from Facebook. We've had a number of great interactions before, and so always a pleasure to talk with you guys. So I have a couple of questions, actually. So one thing is actually about Will's sub-view of open theism, because I'm an open theist myself. Actually, I'm an open panentheist. And so I hold to one kind of open theism, which is different from like Swinburne's view or something like that. And so it sounded like kind of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're like a voluntary notions person. So you would say that God just he just blocks off his knowledge of the future. Is that fair? Or how would you would describe your view?
No, I wouldn't say that he blocks off his knowledge of the future. So my view is nuanced. So number one, I would take the position that the future does not exist. Therefore, there's nothing there for God to know. And then in terms of, I'm pretty sure I know where this is coming from. It's based on what I said at the beginning. And so I would say it this way. There's an interesting conversation to be had, which is the source of God's knowledge. And so I think that that's very fascinating. We have scripture that implies that there are angels that bring God information. And so I don't know if it means that he wouldn't have that without the angels bringing him the information, but it's possible. Then we have, just the ability for God to either A, will to not know something that's going on, or B, and it could be both of these, by the way, to will not to know what could happen, possibilities. And that is something that I just want to be careful on. It's not something that I, would call myself strong on, but I just want to be careful. And again, in the light of trying to figure out exactly who God is, how he works, what he knows, why he knows it, as opposed to saying, here's what I think, and so then I'm going to place that on God himself. And so from a voluntary standpoint, I do think it's possible that God, has, divine nescience. So hopefully that answers that, Kyle.
Yeah, so where would you go from there, Kyle? You're saying that you are an open theist from a panentheist perspective, which if you could explain for the audience, I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit before as it's related to time and the creation of time, and how that would impact creation ex nihilo. But the way that I understand it, you would say that creation is part of an attribute of God. It's coexistent with who God is in some sort of sense.
Yeah. So my view is very weird. So I'm a metaphysical idealist, for one, and so I think that that reality is just consciousness, rather than it's fundamentally consciousness. Anything like physical or something like that. Now there's some nuances to get into there, but my panentheism is real, but it kind of flows from that, because one thing that the panentheist would affirm is that that the universe is eternal, and I'm going to affirm something kind of like that, except I'm just going to say the universe is ex materia. So because I think all the mind of God and part of the mental processes of God, or it's hard to articulate, but something like that. And so I think that the universe came from the mental abstractions of God's mind, which is materia in some sense. And then I'm also a presentist and an open theist. Now I find something closer to like Alan Rhoda or Greg Boyd's view pretty compelling, because part of the reason is I think that the arguments against like the ability to know future free contingent actions, I think those are really compelling. But yeah, that's kind of my view.
I see. Okay. So we understand your perspective a little better, and I think you've got clarification on Will's perspective a little better. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up in a question or a comment? And if not, that's totally fine too.
One thing for Ryan.
Okay.
Yeah, I had one thing for Ryan. So Ryan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the last time we talked about this, you said you're a Mollinist. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm kind of interested. So, one, if you're familiar with some of the thoughts that Alan Rhoda has with respect to Molinism argument and Molinism, and then if you are familiar with that, then like how would you respond? Because he thinks that Molinism entails. Sorry.
Yeah, just could repeat it because it cut out for just a second, so I missed a really important word.
You're good. Alan Rhoda thinks, and I think I'm inclined to agree, that Molinism entails, or it falls into the divine fatalism argument. If Molinism is true and God used his middle knowledge in the creation, then that entails divine fatalism. And so I'm kind of interested if you're familiar with that and what your thoughts are on that.
So it's been a while since I've looked at it. So it's fatalism given for God, or just fatalism for humans?
Fatalism for humans. Basically the argument of if God knows the future, how can we be free, kind of thing. Yeah.
I don't have a whole lot to say in response to it, other than I don't think Molinism gives you an answer to that. So John Martin Fisher and several others will argue that Molinism doesn't give you an answer to the freedom foreknowledge problem. In fact, Molinism just seems like it assumes an answer to the freedom foreknowledge problem. And I think William Lane Craig's admitted this in a couple places as well. And I'm strongly inclined to agree with that Molinism doesn't give you an answer. You have to look elsewhere for that. You could be an Occamist. I don't really like Occamism. There's this crazy time ordering account that Ryan Byerly's doing. I think that's kind of cool, but I'm still trying to figure out the details of that. But Molinism by itself, I don't think it gives you an answer to the freedom foreknowledge problem. So if Rhoda's just trying to attack Molinism on that ground, then I would say, like, yeah, fair point. Molinism doesn't give an answer, but it doesn't seem like it's designed.
So I would have a question then, because it seems like that would be kind of the whole purpose of presenting Molinism in the first place, is to present some sort of alternative for Calvinism or Arminianism as it's related to divine determinism. So if it doesn't present another option for freedom and determinism, then what really is the purpose of Molinism?
Oh, I think Molinism is primarily a theory of providence. So if you can somehow figure out how to reconcile libertarian freedom and foreknowledge, okay, well, cool. Now, what theory of providence do you want to go with? Well, middle knowledge, like that gives you like a whole lot more things that God can know, and it gives God all sorts of like really great providential power. So that's I think that's supposed to be the kind of the benefit there, the payoff of it. So Ken Perzik, who's written a lot on Molinism, he's one of the editors of the book. He's the editor of the book called Molinism: The Contemporary Debate. So he's not a Molinist, but he argues, like, if I affirmed a personal understanding of God, which he doesn't, if I did, then I would affirm Molinism, because it gives God so much more providential power than like what an open theist would get. So I think that's supposed to be the real benefit there, is you get some sort of answer for the freedom foreknowledge problem from somewhere else, and then I've got this great, awesome story of providence to tell you.
So you're saying that you can be a Molinist and still, in some way, affirm that God does not exhaustively know every decision that each individual would freely make, except in the realm of possibility or probability. Is that right?
Oh, no. So the Molinist says, like, that first logical moment, which I don't want to call it a logic, I would just say first temporal moment of natural knowledge, God would know all the logical possibilities, and then at the next logical moment, God considers, he like kind of looks at the next set. He's like, so I've got all these logical possible timelines. Well, some of those are just merely logical. Some of them are feasible. Like, what would creatures actually do with their free will? And then so the middle knowledge is considering that subset of all the logically possible worlds, this subset of all the feasible worlds, of this is what creatures would do with their libertarian freedom. What will they do? Well, God hasn't decreed anything yet, so God hasn't said which timeline is yet. And so then that's the next logical moment. God issues a decree, and then you get the free knowledge, and then you get the foreknowledge. So that's the sort of kind of story that the Molinist typically tells.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Will, do you have anything that you want to add into the conversation that we're having about Molinism with Kyle? Or if not, we can toss it back to you, Kyle, and go from there.
Yeah, just quickly, I actually appreciate where Molinists are coming from. I think they really are, a lot of them in their hearts trying to reconcile, foreknowledge and freedom. And so I think they're trying to, defend freedom, which I completely, appreciate and support. I don't agree with Molinism, but from where they're coming from, I do appreciate it. And it's also good to have other alternatives to the age-old Arminianism, Calvinism debate. So.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. That's good. Okay, Kyle, what else do you have? And if not, that's totally fine. I know that being that you've had discussions with Will and Ryan in the past, I'm sure we could keep this thing going and have a four-way conversation the rest of the episode. But if not, why don't I just give you one more question or comment, and then we'll go on from there.
That'd be perfect, because I do have one teensy little thing.
Okay.
So, and this is, I guess, in regards to the, because Ryan mentioned Ockhamism, and I think that Ockhamism is probably one of the other, in addition to Open Theism, one of the other better responses to the problem of divine knowledge and human freedom. And so that actually kind of interests me about how, if you think Ockhamism has problems, how do you ground counterfactuals on Molinism? How would you say that God knows those things? Because I think that's the biggest problem for both of those views, and that's why I kind of reject both. So how would you ground those, I guess? And that'll be my last bit.
So this is the right question to ask. So the Occamist, some of them are doing this crazy sort of like backwards grounding. So somehow, like, what I'm doing now grounds God's knowledge in the past, and then some others are going, I swear that's not what I'm doing, and I'm just like, okay, I can't see how you're not doing that. So I'm typically kind of just going, I don't understand what you're saying then, because it looks, some people are very explicit, like, yeah, it is some kind of like backwards grounding sort of relation. With regards to like the counterfactuals though, like the grounding objection like is, okay, the grounding literature as a whole is really super weird. And I'm starting to come to the view that the grounding objection, or the grounding principle, these truth maker principles, they're not as intuitive as they seem like. So people who are not even interested in Molinism whatsoever, like Fabrice Correa and Franz Rosenkranz and Ulrich Mayer, they're looking at all these grounding objections and they're going, this truth maker principle, in order to really do all the work it needs to do, you have to add in all sorts of bizarre stuff, like making states of affairs like these fundamental things in reality, having some kind of bizarre like constituents and things like, so you have to do this crazy like sort of story that David Armstrong has. And so these guys are going, why would... that's awful. Like, who knew that something so intuitive would entail that I have to believe like all sorts of crazy stuff? And so this just loses its intuitive appeal. It's kind of the sort of argument that these guys run, completely independent of Molinism whatsoever. They're just looking at the grounding objection to, like, say, like Presentism or something like that. And so their stance is one that I find very attractive, which is, if this grounding principle is entailed towards horribly unintuitive stuff, then something's just wrong with the grounding principle. What replaces it, I don't know. I have no clue. But if it entails all sorts of crazy stuff, then it's not intuitive and it's counterintuitive. And so then this sort of objection to Molinism is going to fall away as well. But I don't know how to summarize all of that stuff in a nice, neat package. It's something I'm still working out. But I can send you links later on Facebook if you want to some of those sources.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That's good. Hey, tag me on that too.
I appreciate it.
Sure.
So.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it. All right. Okay. Oh, crap. I just knocked off Ryan. Sorry. Ryan, jump back on. I was trying to exit Kyle out, and I knocked Ryan off. So, Ryan, jump back on here if you get a chance to.
Hey, Josh. There's a
there we go.
There's a debate going on in the comments. I'd like to just say
okay.
a quick word on.
Yeah, let's see. What is it that I need to bring up?
Morph Wales and Scott Taylor have been talking about who's speaking in Genesis 22. Is it God or is it an angel?
Okay.
And what I believe, and I don't think this is controversial, so I'm really responding to Morph Wales here, is that the angel of the Lord is speaking the words of God. And you'll notice at the end of verse 12, it ends with, since you have not withheld your son, your only son from me. And so obviously, Abraham was not, doing something for an angel. He was doing that for God. And so right. Obviously there's not lowercase and uppercase in the Hebrew, but the translations, probably all of them, capitalize me there because it's obviously referring to God.
Okay, so that's kind of a conversation on whether or not that's the pre-existent Son as the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. Is that kind of where you're going with that, Will?
Not necessarily. I just think that it's pretty clearly the words of God, and so making a big deal about who's communicating those words, I don't think is significant in this context.
Oh. Okay, I'm not sure that I was following that conversation, so I'm not sure. I don't think I'll have much to offer. But I have spent a lot of time in the last few weeks debating with Unitarians and oneness folk as it's related to the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. And actually, I was working on a debate with Carlos Xavier, who is Sir Anthony Buzzard's son-in-law, who's a Unitarian, and they would take the position that the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is a manifestation of the Father in some way, just to kind of avoid the Trinitarian side of the conversation where you've got Yahweh speaking to Yahweh in multiple places, like Genesis 19, the appearance of the angel of the Lord speaking and being worshipped in Genesis 22 as God, and those sorts of things. But anyways, I wasn't following that sort of the conversation, so I think it's good to get clarification there. And Ryan, by the way, I accidentally booted you earlier. I was trying to exit, but welcome back. So, yeah, you're out. So you're just, all right. Anyways, welcome back. So let's pick up the conversation where we were, where we had kind of left off. There's so much more to go, and we're not even going to touch dent and what we had kind of planned out to talk about. But two things, if we do get the time to talk about it, that I really want to, are how does open theism impact kind of these divine attributes of God, like immutability, aseity, foreknowledge, all the omnis that we had talked about earlier, which we've already kind of touched on. But I really want to, so I want to touch on the attributes of God, how open theism impacts those sorts of things, and I really want to get to the incarnation and how these sorts of attributes of God would truly impact the incarnation. So let's see, how do we want to start that side of the conversation with those attributes like immutability, mutability, the experience of God with His creation, and those sorts of things. Maybe you guys can kind of direct the conversation where we go from here.
Yeah, I think talking about
Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I think talking about immutability and timelessness would be exciting for the audience.
Okay, so take it away. Let's define what immutability is and what sort of relationship it would have on the timelessness of God if God was mutable in some way and not others.
So immutability, classically defined, is that God cannot change in any way, shape, or form. And so philosopher and theologian, he would say that means that God cannot undergo any intrinsic or extrinsic change. And then Paul Helm, who's a contemporary classical theist, who has in his book on this is called The Eternal God, where he's defending divine timelessness, he says the kind of immutability you need is where God cannot undergo any intrinsic or extrinsic change, or what we call mere Cambridge change. God cannot change in relation to other things, because in order to undergo those kind of changes, you would already be engaged in succession, and well, you don't have timelessness, because timelessness means, again, without succession. So you really have to have unchanging, completely unchanging, in order to have a successionless God. So that's how immutability and timelessness, it seems like they're mutually entailing because of that.
Okay, Will, let's get your take on it. What's the relationship of immutability and timelessness of God?
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to have a conversation about one or the other and not have the other one come up. There's practically universal agreement that change requires time. So there's the link between immutability and timelessness. That's just, I think, pretty simple to understand. If you have a change, you have a before and after. So the change was from something to something, and that would be very difficult to reconcile, if not impossible, with timelessness and atemporality. And so that's kind of the link. I do think there are ways to hold to a form of immutability without, meeting the classical definitions, without holding to timelessness. For example, me personally, I believe that God is immutable in His character, He's immutable in His love. But if we start talking about what these words really mean in the literature, it's utter immutability. As Ryan mentioned, no intrinsic change, no extrinsic change. And I really simply think that it's not biblical. And, you brought up, Josh, the incarnation. I just don't see how the incarnation is reconcilable with either timelessness or immutability.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Okay. Now, I was going to see if we could direct the conversation into how the theory of time would be related to God's foreknowledge, and specifically 1 Peter 1:2. But let's hold that for a second and see if we can take where we're at in the conversation right now with the incarnation and immutability and change and time and these sorts of concepts with the incarnation, because that's something that is really seems to be drawing a lot of my own attention to that side of the conversation. Ryan, you wrote extensively about that in your book, The End of the Timeless God. You've got an entire chapter on the incarnation. And there's so many references. By the way, guys, if you get a chance to get that book, I would highly recommend it. I mean, I'm not just trying to, suck up to Ryan because he's on my podcast. I'm just telling you, like, seriously, when I went to Will, I was like, hey, Will, I'm kind of looking at diving into some of these topics on trying to understand open theism better. What would you recommend I go and kind of trying to read about and to get a good grasp on these things? The first 2 books he said was, you got to get Ryan Mullins' book, The End of the Timeless God, 1, and then 2, you've got to get God, Time, and the Incarnation. I think that's the title of the other, which I got both of those, and I'm still going through that other one, but I'm telling you that your book, Ryan, has been extremely helpful. One, because, I mean, it's scholarly, but it's still on a level that, you crack jokes in it. It's kind of funny at some spots, but I mean, you talk about the incarnation. So let's talk about the incarnation. Some people would say that when it comes to the incarnation and God being timeless, that he's in an eternal now, that the divine side of the incarnation, the deity of Christ in the incarnation, is still in a timeless state, while yet he is incarnate and in the flesh that is sequential and temporal. So you've got the temporal meeting with the atemporal, the timeless met with time, the sequential met with the eternal now. To me, that seems incoherent, but where do we go in the conversation to kind of work out these seeming contradictions? Will, let's get your take first, and then Ryan, I want to go back to you. Why is the incarnation so important to you as an open theist, and how do you see change in God as it's related to the incarnation?
Sure. Yeah, I think the important piece with the incarnation that's foundational is the difficulty reconciling the incarnation with divine timelessness. The incarnation essentially creates a past in the person of God. And it creates a past because I don't think anybody would argue that God the Son was eternally a man. Arguing that God the Son was eternally a man essentially makes God's existence dependent upon man. And if we go back to what we talked about previously, God didn't even have to create man. And so there's no reason for the second person of the Trinity to be a man. And so, many people are familiar with the term hypostatic union. This is the term in Christianity where the divine nature and the human nature essentially became one. And this is where the human nature was added to the divine nature. These are all temporal terminologies, terms and language. And so what we have with the incarnation is we have a change. Again, I think a lot of people misunderstand what I'm trying to say. Maybe they're mishearing what I'm trying to say. And I'm not saying that this is an intrinsic change, but this is absolutely an extrinsic change. When you have a divine nature that is not hypostatically joined to a human nature, and then that happens, that's an extrinsic change. And that type of a change requires time. It creates a past for God the Son. It actually creates a past for God the Father as well. He was the father of a son with one nature in the past. Presently, he's now the father of a son with 2 natures. And so I think for timelessness and immutability, the incarnation is very difficult, if not possible, to reconcile.
Ryan, let's get your take on that. Obviously, you've got the hypostatic union being brought into this, and the 2 natures, the divine nature met with the human nature. Some sort of change is taking place. I think we can all admit that, but you've got another problem that's kind of exponentially added to that's added to the conversation when you're talking about the Trinity of one being who is God. That now you've got the Son who's taking on another nature. I mean, how are we not adding a fourth person to the Trinity when you might have 2 minds going on here? But let's just take this change from the simple side of the conversation to the incarnation. Where do you go with that, Ryan?
Yeah, so I'll go a little bit slower. So like Will mentioned, it seems like if you're gonna have a personal union, that's what hypostatic union is supposed to be. It's like the 2 natures are united in the person of Christ. well, that human nature, that didn't exist until like 4 BC or something, 2 BC. So God the Son clearly could not be eternally related to this thing, this human nature. So it's got to be a change. And I want to say it's stronger than just merely an extrinsic change, because if I am interacting, well, as my soul interacts with my body, because I'm a substance dualist, so I am a soul and I interact with my body, that's an intrinsic change in me, because I'm thinking one thing and then thinking another thing. I'm willing my arm to go do this, or willing my arm to do that. So those are intrinsic changes, changes in the exercises of my powers. And so I want to say the incarnation seems like God the Son says, hey, we got this plan to save humanity. Father, this sounds cool. Holy Spirit sounds good. All right, well, I'm going to perform an action of going down here and doing this whole ministry thing. And so that is going to be an intrinsic change in the Son as well, it seems, because the Son is going to be performing actions that he was not performing before. He's going to be performing actions like, not crying. Now I'm going to wander off from my parents and go preach in the temple for a little bit. And then when my parents get mad at me, I'll be like, yeah, well, where else did you expect to find me? So these are different actions that it seems like God the Son is taking. And so those are going to be some intrinsic changes too. Now, what you alluded to with seems like I'm adding a fourth person into the Trinity. Well, this is where I think things get really weird. So different people in an attempt to defend timelessness and impassability, what they did was they didn't want to have God the Son suffering, because they can't have that. That'd be awful. That'd be terrible. That'd be the worst thing ever in their minds. Well, but when you read the Bible, that guy's suffering all the time. So what are we going to do with that?
Right.
And so the answer was, well, let's put a soul in there. And so the soul, so God, you've got God the Son assuming a human soul and a human body. And so what Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, and several others would say is the soul serves as a wall to protect the Son from the grossness of human flesh. Mm-hmm. I think that's a direct quote. If not, it's in my chapter somewhere, so you can find the direct quote. So they're throwing a soul there to do it, and then you've got this really kind of weird sort of view. So you've got this view where you got God the Son, who's supposed to be the one doing all the stuff in the incarnation, but then you're like, well, what's the God Son? What's the the perspective of God the Son? Well, he's in a state of pure undisturbed bliss because he's not suffering. He's not undergoing succession because he's timeless. He's not changing anyway because he's immutable. Well, what about the first person perspective of the soul, that human nature? Well, it's suffering. It's undergoing change. It's feeling hungry. It's undergoing temptations. They've got completely different experiences. And then the soul also can pray to the divine mind and communicate to the divine mind. And so you're like, how is that one person? It doesn't look like one person anymore. And the hypostatic union is supposed to be these two natures united in a single one person, not two people. Ooh, I don't know. This doesn't look like one person anymore. This looks like two people, because you got two minds, each with very different experiences, very different beliefs, doing very different things. I don't know. And so one of the questions in a very cheeky sort of way that I ask in the book is, what is the difference between me and Jesus? And so I run these kind of arguments about, well, Jesus is supposed to be incarnate. I'm not. Our experiences are very similar. They're both completely, utterly different from, God the Son. God the Son's not really related to me on the classical story. And on the classical story, God the Son's not really related to his human nature either. And so I'm like, well, why is that guy incarnate and I'm not incarnate?
Right.
I don't see how you're going to get these things. So yeah, I don't know. Those are kind of some different kind of problems I try to lay out. But yeah, I don't know where you want to go with the conversation.
Okay. Well, I'd like to get the solution.
No, sure.
Okay. But no, seriously. Well, let's see where you go with it, because obviously we're talking about the hypostatic union of the divine with the human, the temporal with the atemporal, in a classical model. But how does the open theist model provide a solution to the incarnation that the classic model doesn't?
Sure. Yeah, and I do need to clarify one thing, because I misspoke, and Ryan very gracefully made that known to me. I do believe that the incarnation involves intrinsic change as well. One of the difficulties I have when I'm trying to have a discussion with another believer on timelessness is I want to just focus on timelessness, but the conversation quickly goes to immutability.
Right.
And so I'll often say, let's just assume that we're not talking about any intrinsic changes. So, the divine nature is identical, everything's the same. Let's just focus on the extrinsic change and its relation to temporality versus atemporality. And so I misspoke there. There's really no issues here with the incarnation, with the open theist, or even the Mollinist who's holds to the A theory of time, and a ton of Mollinists hold to an A theory of time. And so really, I think the significant piece here is that Richard Holland, who wrote God, Time, and the Incarnation, what he does in his book, because his whole book really is on the incarnation and God and time, is he looks back throughout Christian history and he's like, okay, what did they do with this? And what he found was that they largely ignored it. Who knows why, but I think the reality is that they either, saw clearly or even intuitively recognized that this is going to be very difficult to make these two work together. And so I do think that Richard Holland's book and Ryan's book are essential reading on the topic of time and God, number one, and then number two, really looking at the incarnation. I feel confident, Josh, telling people that you have to choose between timelessness or the incarnation. You really can't have both in this context. The incarnation, as understood and agreed upon by virtually all Christians, is that a divine nature took on a human nature, and all of the terms that we use to describe this event and the hypostatic union are all terms of succession. And so you really just can't have both. And so I think hopefully Christianity is going to go ahead and keep the incarnation and reject timelessness.
Okay, so that's a strong stance to take. I think that there's a good point to be made there, and I think that's probably kind of the suggestion that you're making and Richard Holland is making as well, that this problem is historically been avoided. But Ryan, do you see that as kind of the two choices that you've got here? You either have to get rid of the timelessness of God, or you have to accept the incarnation, that there was intrinsic and extrinsic change that took place within God at the incarnation. Because it seems like to me there's an element of kind of what we would describe as a problem with the flesh, to the point that God couldn't actually truly become human in every sense that we are human, because there's some intrinsic problem with flesh. And if God were to become flesh like we are in every way, then he would in some sense be sinful as the flesh of what we humans are sinful. But that might be a step further than where we need to go right now. Let's just see if we can identify that you either need to hang on to or get rid of timelessness if you're going to have a true incarnation. What would your answer be, Ryan?
I want to say that, it really is incarnation or timelessness. I don't think you can have both of them. But I've got different friends who are, wanting to defend the compatibility of the two. So Tim Paul has two different books on what he calls conciliar Christology, where he's trying to work out all the fancy footwork you need to do in order to get a compatibility between the two. But when I've asked him in person about it, the sticking point for me is over the hypostatic union, because I want to know, how do you get that union? And Tim says, well, it's an ineffable mystery, because he's just trying to stick with, this is what the councils are saying, and then go from there. And I'm like, well, see, that's the very thing that I need to know.
That's what I'm saying. That's not good enough for me. Like, at some point, we've got to go, well, it can't just be a mystery when we're taking a stance on it. Like, we're taking a stance, but it's a mystery. And it's like, well, you can't tell me I'm wrong if you don't have, if you're just going to punt to mystery. Like, to me, it does seem like, I don't know, it's problematic.
So I had this great experience where so Tim and his wife Faith were in St. Andrews for a little while, because Faith had a postdoc research position there, and so I was able to get Tim to teach in my class for a bit. And so we had a day on the incarnation, and my students were just grilling him. And when they got to that point, they were like, well, now you can't just build everything off the mystery, and like, and Tim's like, I'm just telling you I'm just trying to give you a consistent story of what, how to have a logically consistent story of the councils. And they're like, but I want to know more. I want to know that bit right there. And he's like, mystery is part of their story. And they're like, they didn't like it. But Tim was, able to be like, I'm just giving the logical story of how it's built off of that. I'm like, So that would be something, I guess, if you could, someone would push back and go, well, if you're asking how to get that, you can't get it. I can give you the logical story built on top of that. But if that's what you're really getting at, and I'm like, well, but that is what I really want to get at. I really do want to know that. How do you get this personal union between the two natures and still have it be a timeless, impassable, all those things?
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think you need it.
Okay, so tell me, Ryan, how do you have an a theory of time within Mullinism, and how does that impact the incarnation with Mullinism?
So an a theory of time just says that tense facts are like part of the fundamental features of reality, part of the fundamental story. So tense facts like what was the case, what is the case, and what will be the case. And so there's something about the now, about the present, that has some sort of privileged status. But there's a bunch of different like ontologies that are consistent with an A theory. So presentism is one of them. You could have a growing block where the past present equally exist. You could have a moving spotlight where like you've got this eternal block of time, and then there's like the spotlight that's pointing out like which one's the present. So you got a bunch of different options if you're an A theorist. If you're a Molinist, you could do all the things you want to do with it. So you could be a presentist like William Lane Craig and say there are certain tense facts about what will take place. Like once God goes through all those steps of the different moments from natural knowledge to middle knowledge to free knowledge. And so once God gets the free knowledge, he gets the foreknowledge of this is what will be the case. And so you could still have your kind of presentist story, but certain truths about the future are going to have a determinate truth value. So what will do and what Ryan will do, the truth values of those propositions are set as either true or false. The actual existence of those events, well, they don't come into existence until they become present. And so that's kind of the way the Molinist would tell the story. When it comes to the incarnation, they would say a similar sort of thing. So once God looks at all the different timelines, and he's like, I like this one. This one's pretty cool. God the Son, you okay with that? You're going to become incarnate? And he's like, Father, that sounds great. So let's do this one. And so then they would set in place and all the truth values of like, this is how when the incarnation will take place. This is when the Son will become incarnate. But that event won't exist until it becomes the present. I guess that's kind of how the Mullins would tell the story.
Okay, well, let's get your take on it. I think you've kind of already answered it, but do you see any problems with the incarnation as it would be related? Because, I mean, you've got an A theory of time with Mullinism, but you would have a problem with the determinism side of it that maybe, I don't know. Where would you want to go in that side of the conversation?
Well, not all Molinists are atheorists, but the ones that don't have an issue with the incarnation specifically related to timelessness. So I think the whole determinism debate is completely separate and not really related to the timelessness debate. And so, most Molinists that I interact with hold to an A theory, and so they don't have an issue here.
Cool. Okay, now let's see, is there anything else on the incarnation that we want to deal with? Did you guys want to talk about whether or not there is a fourth person of the Trinity added with two wills, two minds, two natures in the incarnation, or is that something not really related?
I don't see a fourth person of the Trinity. A lot of theologians will create one when they're trying to defend certain attributes of God. But to me, a person and a nature are not the exact same thing. And so we have one person with two natures, and obviously there's going to be some mystery to this, just like we can't fully comprehend the Trinity, but there's absolutely not a fourth person. Yeah. So there's one will, and God took on flesh. He became a man.
Yeah.
And so exactly how that works, we don't really know, but it's still just it's the exact same person. It's just now a person with a human nature.
Ryan, do you agree with that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of fancy footwork I could do to try to like flesh out the story, but I don't think we have time for that. But yeah, so there's a book called Christian Physicalism ? Edited by Josh Ferris and Mark Cortez, and so I've got a paper in there on the incarnation where I try to flesh out like my own understanding of how I think you get an incarnation without having two people in God the Son and in Jesus Christ. So yeah, if people want to see details, that's where they can go.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we're coming up on 2 hours. I think that'd be a pretty good timeline to kind of wrap up this episode. So let's hit on one more point, and I do want to give you guys in the audience a chance to call in. Now would be that time. You can either call in on that number on your screen, 816-866-0025, or you can join the live stream. Some of you have done, or if you don't want to get your question in that way, just type in question in whatever platform you're watching on, and we'll try to get your question in to either Will or Ryan. But I think this would be a good place to wrap up the episode in describing the relationship of time and God's knowledge, specifically related to 1 Peter 1:2, where it says, "Elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ, grace unto you and peace be multiplied." Specifically, the elect according to the foreknowledge of God. Now, how would you guys take the theory of time, everything that we've kind of discussed up to this point, and tie it together with 1 Peter 1:2 as it's related to election and foreknowledge? And whoever wants to go first, I'd have at it, and then we'll just go to the next one and go from there.
Great. So, I love pointing this out, but foreknowledge and predestination are temporal words. So foreknowledge means to know beforehand. And so if we're talking about an atemporal God, his entire existence is simultaneous. And there is no knowing something beforehand. There's no determining something beforehand with the word predestination. And so I actually think foreknowledge fits in here quite well, which is to know beforehand. And there's a true beforehand in God's life. The question of election is a completely different topic, which is, fun to talk about. I do hold to a corporate election, which a lot of, Arminians and Mullinists do. And that's a big, issue with Calvinism. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I affirm and defend foreknowledge, and I do think true foreknowledge requires a God that's in time. And interestingly enough, there are some authors, they're escaping me right now, but I've got them, listed somewhere, that have admitted that foreknowledge is essentially a figure of speech, and it's just trying to describe something to us that we can understand, but they're at least being consistent with their view of God being timeless.
Okay. Ryan, how would you answer that? Does God have foreknowledge? Does he elect? What's going on here? God's got foreknowledge. There's election taking place, and it seems to be based off of this knowledge that he has beforehand. How would you deal with 1 Peter 1:2 as it's related to everything that we've built on up to this point?
Well, I mean, Will's point I think is excellent, because the words used are temporal words, and so then you have to mention some of the people that Will had in mind. So like Eleanor Stump, for instance, and then Boethius. I think Augustine does this as well. John Calvin. I mean, lots of people, they'll just go, well, it's not literally a before, because then God wouldn't be timeless. And I'm like, okay, cool. So how much Scripture is really metaphorical? And it seems like a strikingly large, if not almost every single thing in Scripture becomes metaphorical. And at some point, it's like, what is this possibly a metaphor for? Because so different biblical scholars like Terence Fredham and others will say metaphors in Scripture, even the metaphors in Scripture, they have a grain to them. They have like a direction they're trying to push. And if you come up with a story of what's going on there that goes against the grain of the metaphor, well, then you're going against Scripture. So things like before, I don't think that could be metaphorical. It doesn't sound very metaphorical. It sounds quite literal. But even if you do want to take it as metaphorical, then you're like, well, yeah, there's just no such thing as a before whatsoever, then I'm like, I don't know what this is a metaphor for. It seems like you're going against even the metaphorical grain of what Scripture's teaching. So yeah, I think, so I think passages like that just demonstrate that the Bible just has zero understanding of God as timeless. I think it's all the biblical descriptions of God are temporal.
Okay. All right, well, that's good. We've got one last point that I think that was brought up here that's related to what we just talked about with the incarnation. I'll get your take on it, and then I think we can wrap it up unless somebody has a call or would like to join the live stream. This comes from Thezervin, I guess. Maybe I'm saying that wrong. I don't know. But he says the hypostatic union entails that Jesus had a soul because humans have souls. I wonder if he holds a similar Christology as William Lane Craig. How would you answer that? As it's, I know, Ryan, you've written extensively on this, the different possibilities of how this works out in the incarnation, and we didn't have time to get into all of it, but specifically with this guy's question in the hypostatic union of the soul of Jesus, would you see the human Jesus having a soul, a spirit, and consciousness? Obviously, being a dualist, you would have the interaction of the spirit with the flesh. So how does that work with the William Lane Craig Christology?
Mm-hmm. So Craig's view, I think it goes something like this. So to be a person, to be a person is to be a rational mind. To be a human person is to be a rational mind with a human body. Well, how does God the Son become? Well, he's already a person because he already has a rational mind. Well, how does he become a human person? Well, he's just got to get a body. I mean, come on, there you go. And then now, how does he have a human soul? Well, in virtue of being related to a human nature, he is a human soul. And so I'm like, that seems pretty cool. And it looks like it might be Nestorian, or not Nestorian, might be Apollinarian. And Craig actually calls it a neo-Apollinarian view. And I'm like, maybe, I don't know. Apollinarius actually thought there was more than a person is not just a rational soul and a body. I mean, he thought there was a rational soul and a spirit. And I don't know what the spirit's doing, but he thought there's this other thing going on there. So Craig's view isn't that close to exactly like Apollinarian's view. My view is similar to that, but it's I'm following a model that Andrew Loke has developed called a pre-conscious model, where there's some more bells and whistles thrown in there that I don't have time to go into. But yeah, so I'm closer to Andrew Loke's model than William and Craig's model.
I see. Okay. Now, Will, you've consistently said that God took on flesh; he became a human. Now, I'm not sure that maybe I missed it, maybe you said it, maybe I missed it though. As it's related to the kind of the specifics of this question with the hypostatic union, was there an additional soul in the human Jesus, or was it just merely the Son of God, God the Son, coming down and taking on flesh in the incarnation and not adding to himself another soul, but obviously adding another nature, maybe without a human soul?
Yeah, great question. I'm still trying to figure out if I'm a dichotomist or trichotomist. So these are difficult issues that take, really a lifetime of thought and research on. And I'm still, in terms of Jesus and the soul, I'm still working all that out.
Yeah. Cool. Fair enough. Well, okay. Let's see. I know we've got a lot more that we wanted to get to. Will, we didn't even. There was so much that I wanted to get to on your side of the conversation with opentheism.org, specifically with aseity and conversations related to aseity and divine determinism and foreknowledge and Mullinism and those sorts of things, which we kind of touched on real briefly, but we didn't get to. Dive into all of that as much as I think that we had in the notes, and that's totally fine. But guys, I do want to give you the last word. I think 2 hours is a pretty good time to shut down this particular episode. But I do appreciate you guys coming on, and let me turn it over to you guys for the last word. Ryan, maybe you could go first, and then I'll turn it over to you, Will, and see how you would like to leave the audience with everything that we've kind of mulled around in this episode, and kind of wrap it up with one concluding remark, if possible.
I guess I want to just echo what Will said. Is a lot of the questions that we've been looking at tonight, they take years of really careful study if you want to do them justice.
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff related to God and time, that's been an ongoing project of mine for over 10 years now. stuff related to freedom and foreknowledge. That's a small side project that I've done that I'm like, I don't feel like I've done it justice to really, have a good say on the matter. So yeah, these are all really complicated topics, and I'm glad that we can have a discussion about them in a friendly way and hopefully clarify some things. But yeah, it's hard stuff, and it takes a lot of homework to do before you can really make up your mind.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for that. Dr. Mullins, you're welcome back anytime. Thanks again for coming on Talking Christianity. It's been an awesome conversation. I've been looking forward to this. And for the audience, you guys may not know, but I just had to get an appendectomy, I guess that's the word, get my appendix removed a couple days ago. And so I'm not really all with it. That's probably why I'm fumbling over my words so much. And I told Ryan and Will before we got started, I'm like, guys, you're going to have to carry the conversation, I think. And it's been fun to have this conversation as something that is a passion of mine, because it's related to the knowledge of God, the incarnation, and really for me on a practical side, it's like, what's my interaction with God look like in my daily life, in prayer, and my walk with the Lord and my family, and those sorts of things. Like, is God personal? Is he impersonal? Is it all just a script? Am I just an actor in a play? Like, how do these things work in real life? And both of you guys have been really helpful for me in my journey to kind of grasping some of these concepts to the point that I can really mull it over and come to a conclusion about what I believe. So thank you guys, both of you, for that. And Will, I do want to give you a chance to give concluding remarks. How would you leave our audience based off the conversation that we've had and dealing with open theism and the timelessness of God, and whether or not God is personal and those sorts of things? So, yeah, absolutely. I think who God is really central to almost any Christian doctrine, and so centering our studies on that and never giving up on trying to better understand God's nature and who He is going to be critical. I don't know how many people in your audience are familiar with Ryan Mullins, but if they're not, they will be. And I think that his book on timelessness, which is the end of the timeless God, is essentially, if it's not already, will be essential reading. Yeah. If you want to, understand all these different sides of the issue on timelessness. Just to warn everybody, you'll have sticker shock. It's my understanding that Ryan has no say on the price of the book, and so you'll have to take that up with Oxford. But it's worth every penny, and I'm thankful for Ryan and that book, because it's moved the needle on the issue of timelessness. Yeah. For arguably the first time in centuries. So I agree. Definitely encourage people to read that book. That's good. I totally agree with that. Go get that book if you get a chance. If you get a chance to, The End of the Timeless God, and your other book that just came out not too long ago, I think in August. Is it God and Emotion? Is that what it's called, Ryan? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Cambridge actually made this one affordable. It's only $20. So, yeah. Thanks for that. We need to send some letters to Cambridge to get the price down on The End of the Timeless God. Yeah, but it would be nice. Yeah. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for coming on to Talking Christianity. You're welcome back anytime. Hopefully we can pick this up in the future and see if we can pick up where we left off at some point. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure. Thanks. So, all right. Hey, I'm going to cut to closing scene here and cool. See if we can fill you in on what's coming up down the pipeline for the audience. And go from there. If it's going to switch scenes there. So give it just a second. Turn the volume down on that. And let me get this up. So anyways, guys, this has been a good conversation to have. I really appreciate both Will and Ryan coming on to have this conversation on open theism and the timelessness of God as it's related to foreknowledge and the incarnation. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Please feel free to write them and visit their website, opentheism.org, for Will Duffy. And I'd encourage you to listen to Ryan Mullins' podcast, The Reluctant Theologian, as well. If you didn't get a chance to last week, we had a debate between Stephen Avery and James Snap Jr. on Codex Sinaiticus, the world's oldest Bible, The thesis was the world's oldest Bible is a replica, Simonides the scribe. That was an excellent debate. Guys, it lasted 3.5 hours. And there's so much information in there, and we really just barely kind of scratched the surface on the depth of where that conversation can and should go. That was a good one. So go back and listen to that if you get a chance to. But in 2 weeks, I'm going to have Dr. Wagner, Brian Wagner on, and Drew McLeod from the Provisionist podcast. And we're going to talk about kind of what we talked about tonight, God, time, and theological ramifications. Brian Wagner holds to dynamic omniscience, that perspective. It's similar to Open Theism. There's some distinctions between those two positions, but it's going to be a good conversation to have as well. Hopefully we'll be able to understand what those theological ramifications are as it's related to the incarnation, and specifically the eternal decree and the fall of Adam and Eve in the beginning. And we'll go from there. But there were so many other things that I was working on that we were going to have coming through the pipeline, like Brian Abishano. We were going to do an episode next week with that, but I promised my wife, we've got so much going on in life right now, that I was going to cut back. I just picked 2 episodes that I want to do, and then I'm going to take a break from podcasting for a while. So I really wanted to have this one today with Will Duffy and Ryan Mullins, and I want to have that one with Brian Wagner and Drew McLeod. Everything else I'm shutting down, and maybe we'll come back to it eventually, like that debate on Lordship Salvation with Cole Perkins, and a baptism debate with Kevin Hughes, and then the Dale Tuggy and Edward Dalcour debate on the Trinity and the triunity of God, and other episodes like that. But guys, I do appreciate you sticking with me, and hopefully this has been a blessing to you. Feel free to stay in touch with me all you can, and I'll do the same online. But I'm going to step back after this next episode with Drew McLeod and Brian Wagner, and come back to it at some point down the line. But got more important things to focus on in life right now than a podcast, and even though this is my passion, this is my way to reach the world for the gospel and the truth of who God is, and how you can have a relationship with Him and spend eternity with God. So I'll come back to it. But anyways, guys, God bless. I hope you have a great day, a great evening, and if you're football fans, go Chiefs. Next week we're going to take it home, second year in a